Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Oh, it is so good to be home and to see everybody. This is, you can sing all the song you wanted to. It's not going to hurt my feelings because it absolutely kind of goes with what we're going to sit here and talk about this morning, because it is so good to be home. God is faithful. God has given us another opportunity, and it's good. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you that this is actually the first church service I have been in since March 17th. Because where I live, we're still not having church services. It's all online. And so I've actually tuned in on y'all, watching y'all on Sunday morning, sitting on my couch with my coffee. I'm like, hey, this is kind of cool. Maybe this is how we can do church from now on. But no, there's something that was missing about being around each other. So it was great to actually be, for my very first time, actually getting a chance to come back to worship service, to being back home here with family. Because as we just sung, God is faithful. God works through things, God helps us through things, God brings us to a point, and guess what? We're here. It's confusing. It's a confusing time. If you're not confused, then I need to talk to you afterwards, because you got to explain some things to me about how we can figure some of these things out. So if you got your Bibles, go ahead and open them to Acts chapter 1, because in Acts chapter 1, it was a really confusing time for the disciples. The disciples had been with Jesus for about 3.5 years. They had seen him do some unbelievable things. They had seen him die. They had seen him resurrected. And now he is here. And it's about the last week, 10 days or so, before he's about to leave and goes home to heaven. And so he kind of leaves them with a little story. So I want to start here. Let's start here, beginning in Acts chapter 1. Let's kind of back up here to... Let's back up here to verse 4. Let's start over here to verse 4. And while they were staying with them, he ordered them not to depart to Jerusalem, but to wait for the promise which God had said, "You had heard from me, for John baptized with water, but you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit in not many days after." So verse 6. So when they had come together, they had asked him, "Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" This is just another wonderful occasion that Jesus is with his disciples, that he's sitting here talking with them, having a good time, telling about some things, and he says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you some instructions, but I'm also going to tell you there's a promised gift that's coming. I'm going to tell you what to do. I'm going to tell you how to do it, but also wait, because this is what it's about to do. And they're asking them, though, at verse 6, is this the time when you're going to restore the kingdom? And I wish we had time to really dive into what that really meant and what they're trying to sit here and ask this question of Jesus. But I want you to kind of sit here and focus on this phrase when they said, "At this time." Is this the time that you are going to do that? We wish we knew. I don't know if it's about you, but a lot of us are people that are scheduled people. As I have gotten older, I have gotten to become more of a scheduled person, because I pull out the calendar, I have a Google Calendar, I have it sitting to my phone. I need to know where I'm supposed to be, when I'm supposed to be, and how I'm supposed to be there to do it. We are scheduled people. And so at this time, they have sit here and they're waiting. Is this when we're going to get our nation back? Is this what we're going to do? Jesus has been talking with them about the church and about the kingdom of God, and they're still looking for this physical kingdom. And he says this in verse 7. It is not for you to know the times or seasons that the Father has fixed by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. He said, I want you to know it's not for you to know the times. And I think as human beings, that's what we struggle with the most. We struggle with the most of trying to understand God. Why are you doing this? When are you doing this? And when is this going to change? Because we are scheduled people. I don't know about you, but did you have on your calendar to mark 2020 the way that 2020 has turned out? I don't think so. If you did, we definitely got to talk after this is over. Because either you jinxed us or you're really a prophet and I need to come and find out what's going on in this. None of us sat here and planned for 2020 to turn out the way this has. I know I sure didn't. Look, I have longer hair than you've ever seen in your entire life, for those who know me. For if you don't know me, we'll talk afterwards and we'll get to know each other. I've never had hair this long in my life. I was scheduled to get a haircut the week that in Alabama they decided we're going to put a shelter in place in. And guess what? Then we had nothing open for like 2 or 3 months. And I was like, well, thanks, grown-up. I'll just grow it out. And so we'll see what it turns out in a year. I may chop it off before it's over. But we had so many things scheduled. I was scheduled that we had this going on this weekend, this going on the next weekend, this going on this weekend. And one by one, everything was shut down. And that's the way our 2020 has turned out. It has turned out to be something that we didn't schedule. It has turned out to be a crazy year. Our lives have become, and I heard this word last week, and I think it's a really, really good word. Our lives have become unschedulable. Now, don't worry. Yes, I'm on college campus, and I know that that's not a word. I looked it up to make sure. It should be. It's a really good word. But that's what we've turned into. We're unscheduled. We are at a point where things just doesn't seem to follow. And folks, there are some things that don't check your schedule. We can try to schedule, this is when I'm going to go to the gym. Well, this is when I'm going to start school. Well, this is when I'm going to have a date night. And there are certain things that just don't check your calendar. So what about God? Are there ever any times in your life when God does not check your schedule? When things just says, I know you wanted to go left, but we're going to go right. Where things just kind of come in and change some things. There are some things about God that are just very interesting. These are big words that you get to kind of study and you kind of try to figure out. One of those words is immutable. Immutable. That God's nature does not change. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 8, the Hebrew writer says that Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And aren't you glad that there are some things about God, about his nature, that he does not change? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. That what can separate us from the love of Christ, Paul says in Romans chapter 8, nothing. Nothing. Neither height nor depth, nothing can separate you from the love of God. Aren't there some things about God that you are glad he does not change? Second word, that God is also impeccable. God is holy. God is set apart. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 16, be holy as I am holy. Quoting all these Old Testament passages, Peter is sitting there explaining how God is holy. So his nature never changes. He's always holy, but then he's also incomprehensible. This is the thing that still blows my mind about God, and maybe because that's why we use that word incomprehensible. Every time I think I have a better understanding of who God is, it's almost like the goalpost changes. It's like it moves a little bit further. And it's like God still wants you, and we sit here and we have this word, and he sits here and he says, let me show you what I'm about. Let me show you what I can do for you. And you sit here and you begin and you study about who God is. And it's like, I want to know more. And you hunger to know who God is more. And you think you have a grasp. And that moment when you have that grasp, it's almost like, no, keep coming. Keep coming. Because he's incomprehensible. God says, you're not going to know everything about me, but the way you think about me better change. God is unschedulable. And many challenges, that you may be thinking about right now and thinking about God, you may look at your life and say, well, God, right now I'm off schedule with where I thought I would be. And God says you're right on time. Think about Paul in Acts chapter 9 as he's heading down the road to Damascus, and God shows up at a time when none of us would think, why are you showing up here? Paul is a guy that's going to kill Christians. And God shows up right on time and says, you're my guy. The man that none of us would want to have dinner with at that time because of what he was doing, God shows up and says, you're the perfect person I'm looking for. And all of you may be in a different time. Your life may be off schedule, but you may be right on time for God. And there's a reason why we started here in Acts chapter 1. Because the disciples have been through a lot with Jesus. And they've been through a lot with Jesus that they may not have understood what was happening. Have you? Have you ever been in a season with God, in a season with Jesus, that you've ever sat back and asked, God, I just don't understand? Because it's all throughout the Bible. You don't think Job ever asked the question, God, I'm sorry, I just don't understand. You ever think that Joseph ever sat back when he's sitting in prison and said, well, God, I just don't understand? And these disciples had been with Jesus for 3.5 years. They had seen him go to the cross. They'd seen him do that thing on the third day when he was resurrected from the grave. And so now they're sitting here and they still want this thing about this kingdom. And God is saying, no, it's not your time to understand what we're doing. And sometimes he tells them something, but he didn't give them all the details. Sometimes he may tell us something and doesn't give us all the details. How many of you would love to have God come down right now and say, here's what I want for you to do in your life. Here's what I want you to do tomorrow. Here's what I want you to do Monday, Tuesday. Here's what I want your Wednesday to be like. How many of you would love to have God come down and do that? It would sure make life a whole lot easier at times, wouldn't it? But God does give us some things, doesn't he? Love your neighbor as yourself. Forgive others as God and Christ forgave you. Do everything without grumbling and murmuring. If we could just do those 3 things, God says, okay, come back, we'll talk. If we can just handle those 3 things right there. So God does give us some things in his life, but he sits here and he says, guess what? There are going to be some things and you're going to go through and you're going to have a hard time. Have you ever had those moments where you're going through a hard time and people come up to you and say, 10, 15, 20 years from now, you're going to laugh at this? And at that moment, you want to say, no, but I know in a few minutes you're going to hurt from this because I'm going to punch you in the face. There are many times when we sit back, and it's true because there are times now I can sit back and I want to laugh. Boy, I can't believe I acted like that 10 years ago. Can't believe, I thought this was the end of the world. Life was over. And I'm still here. And that's kind of some of these things that takes place. And so you have some of these people throughout history. Abraham's one of them. If you got your Bibles, let's go ahead and flip over to Genesis chapter 12, and we're going to kind of poke here this morning, because after all, this is what the children, the disciples were asking, is this when you're going to restore the kingdom? Well, we're going to talk about who the kingdom got started through, because this is what we're talking about. And God calls him out here in Genesis chapter 12. He says, I want you to leave your home. I want you to leave your family. I want you to leave everything that you know that is signifying of stability, and I want you to go to a place that you don't know. He was called out by a God that he could not see, and yet Abraham got up out of his chair and he went. And I want you to kind of see what takes place here, because Genesis chapter 12 is similar to Acts chapter 1. And instead of God starting the church like he did in Acts chapter 1, God is starting this nation. Verse 1, the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and from your kindred and from your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. Do you get that? Stop and listen to what he's saying there. First of all, he's saying, I will make you a great nation. He is saying, first of all, there's a process behind this. There's a process behind what you're doing. And he goes and he says, I will bless you. He made a promise. And he said there's a process. He spoke it, but he didn't necessarily say he was going to see it. Oh, no, that's the hard one. How many times we're in our lives when we are sitting here at a point when we're saying, God, I really don't understand. And he says, trust me, but we can't see the end. You realize Abraham never saw the promise come through? The total fulfillment of the promise? He never saw it. Hebrews chapter 11. When the Hebrew writer is sitting here describing about the faith that these men had, remember, because the nation comes through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13, it says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, not having seen them, but they saw them afar off. They knew that God was faithful. They knew that God would take them through these moments from A to B to C, and that eventually the promise would come through, and that it would be fulfilled. Amen. And he says, I will bless you. I will take you. I will make your name great and make you a blessing. Folks, let me tell you something here. And I'm not sure what your view of God is this morning. You go to your job and it pays you, but it's God that gives you that blessing. Amen. He's giving you the talents, he's giving you the abilities, he's opened a door for you to be able to go and use them. Someone comes to encourage you, or you go to encourage someone, and God says, look, I'm here, and he's blessing you, because he's immutable. He's impeccable. He's incomprehensible, which means you don't always know the how, even though you know the who. Do you get that? It doesn't necessarily mean we don't necessarily know how I'm going to get here, but God says, trust me, I will get you across that river. You don't think when that nation of Israel was sitting here, they've left Egypt, they're heading for the promised land, and here they come, and they got a major problem because they got the Jordan River that they've got to cross over to be able to go over and take the promised land. And God says, I'm going to get you across. And then they come to Jericho, and there's this wall that has the cities that have massive walls around it that they can put chariots on and run it across the top. Well, God, we just don't know how we're going to do this. He said, don't worry, I got you. And all of us, even in this moment and in this time in our lives, we are in a faith moment where we have to ask ourselves, God, will you get me from A to B to C? And he says, yes, trust me. But as Americans and as human beings, we struggle with that. We have had to learn to change our lives, haven't we, over the last 6 months? I've had to learn to cook better. So there's some nights I starve. Because I can't run down to Walmart at 8:37 anymore at night because it's closed. I can't run down to, I try to stay away from McDonald's nowadays, but McDonald's, because it's closed. Finally, they've opened it back up so I can eat. Why? Because God is sitting here, even when there are points, and he says, trust me. He says, I'm going to make you a great nation. You're going to be a blessing. And then verse 3, look at what he says. Do you see what God says here? I will bless those who bless you, and to him who dishonors you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Do you see what God is saying? He says, through you, I'm going to do all this. Then verse 4, so Abram went as the Lord told him, and Lot also went with him. And watch this. Abram was what? 75 years old when he departed Haran. Do you get that a little bit for a second? Isaac was not even born yet, and yet God is sitting here saying, I'm going to make you this great nation. But I'm sorry, I don't know about you a little bit, but 75 years old is a little late. It's a little off schedule. It's a little bit behind the times of what we are planning to do. Folks, there are going to be people in your life that's going to say, it's a little late, sorry. You know what? You should have prayed about that. The devil's maybe sitting back there and saying, you should have prayed about that in February because I was sitting in Corona in March. He may be sitting there saying to you, it's a little bit late because you know your past. I know that past. And it's a little bit, it's too late. But those people at that church, they're not going to care about you. They're not going to want to listen to you. It's too late. I wonder if God shows us that he doesn't need to be bound by a human schedule to accomplish his purpose. You may sit up there and you may be out there this morning and you say, well, I'm 19 years old. What can I really do for God? Well, God looked down at Timothy when he was getting ready to start ministering in Ephesus, and he said, don't let anyone look down upon you because you're young. He told Jeremiah, he said, before I formed you in the womb, I made a promise that this is what you were going to do. God is not bound by our human schedule and our human calendar and our human time. And he can show up in moments when you and I don't expect him to show up. And when he shows up, he shows out. God is not sitting here looking at 2020 and saying, boy, I can't wait till December 31st. Woo! Because January 2021, then I can really do some work. God does not do that. Don't limit God. Amen. He says, I will bless all the nations of the world. Well, God, it's a bad time. It's really, it's really not a good time. I really can't do it right now. I'm single. I can't do this. Well, God, this is not a good time. I just got married. We don't have a lot of money. We can't do this. I have kids now. God, it's not a good time. God, I got a job I've got to go to do. And, if I don't go do this, I won't be able to live. It's not a good time. Well, now we got this corona thing going around right now. And it's just not a good time. Or when would be a good time for God? Done one thing I've learned over the last couple of years now, I've learned more about sales. One thing I read in the book is you don't ask a person, can you come and see them? You use the phrase, when would be a good time? You don't give them the option. You're like, okay, here's what it is. So let me ask you a question. When would be a good time for God to show up for you? Some of us are sitting there saying, well, this is 2020 could just shown up about, 20 years ago. That would have been really, really great to happen. When would be a good time? Think about John chapter 11. Remember that story? Mary and Martha come to Jesus. Lazarus is sick. Need to come and heal him. Well, it's not really the right time, Mary and Martha. They go their business. Jesus goes and his disciples, he goes and does his business. 2 days, Lazarus dies. 4 days later, here comes Jesus showing up. Mary and Martha meet him out there on the road. Why are you coming now? It's too late. It's a bad time. He's already in the tomb. Why are you doing? If you had to come here now, this wouldn't have happened. And you got to think about something. Put it in kind of in our day and time of how we live. Mary and Martha are major donors to Jesus' ministry. They're one of his top people. These are the type of people that you're supposed to drop everything and run to. And yet Jesus goes in a different direction, and this thing falls off. It's not that time. Jesus and his disciples going off in a different direction, and probably his disciples are saying, hey, we need to go back. This doesn't look good. We need to go back to take care of our friend Lazarus, and yet Jesus is healing the lame man. Do you think we could have waited a little bit on the lame man and gone and take care of Lazarus? You're kind of showing up here at a bad time. You can tell what's important by what you schedule. You ever think about that? You can tell what's really important to you in your life and what's a priority in your life by what you schedule. Is church a priority? Is God a priority? Oh, we'll plan when we need to go get this done. We'll plan to go to the doctor. Or we'll plan to go to get a haircut, maybe. And then we'll plan to go do all these other things. And you can tell what's important by what a person schedules. And it may not have been on the disciples' schedule, but it was on Jesus' schedule. Just because you didn't see it coming didn't mean it didn't come from God. God doesn't check your schedule. Is this the time for the kingdom? That's what they asked him. And he said, you're missing the point. Mark chapter 5. You remember Mark chapter 5? Jairus. In verse 21, Jairus comes to Jesus and talks about his daughter. And remember, Jairus is like one of the main leaders of the synagogue, of the people that are there. He's one of the main religious leaders. And he comes and says, hey, my daughter is sick. And so Jesus is saying, okay, let's go see him. And you remember what happens on that road when he's going to go heal Jairus' daughter? There's a woman that has, she's got a problem. They call it an issue of blood. She would be what is considered unclean by societal standards. And she reaches out and she touches Jesus, and Jesus feels it come from him, and he stops. And he has this conversation with this woman that is here. But do you remember what happens while he stops? Jairus' daughter dies. Because he had, in their mind, gotten off schedule. But for God, he showed up at the right time. Some of you are worried about your kids going back to school. Rightfully so. I hear y'all are starting around here. In Alabama, they finally nailed down what they were going to do. For most in the Montgomery area, they are going virtual for the first 9 weeks. They finally came out with it. That's all you heard for the last 2 weeks leading up to they finally announced, what are we going to do? Because your kids have been off schedule for the last 6 months. And we sit back and we say, well, I need details about some of these things. You know, think about this. All of us, most of us in here, we're excited about you. We're usually excited about first Saturday in September. Why? That's college football. I mean, we're excited about it. We can tell the time of year because those guys run out there with the colored helmets, and they run out there with the tight pants, and they run out with the big shoulder pads on. We know what time of the year it is. And so when everybody's talked about, well, we'll just move football to spring, everybody's like, no, we can't do that. Because why? It's a fall thing. That's when we're scheduled by the time that's going to come on. How am I going to know what I'm going to do? How do you keep your priorities when life wrecks your schedule? While Jesus is healing the woman, the little girl died in verse 35. Everybody was sitting here saying, it's too late. Don't bother the teacher there in Mark 5. God still has you. God still has your children. You've been put in this position, and it's important for his purpose. And to be just like what Jesus stopped for that woman. It was off everyone else's schedule. Remember when he went to the well in John chapter 4? He sits there, and the disciples are sitting here saying, no, we're not going through Samaria. And Jesus says, absolutely, we're going through Samaria. You see, because the Jews didn't want to go to Samaria because they have so much pride and they have so much prejudice and they have so much hatred for these people, they don't want to even talk to them. And yet Jesus says, this is my schedule and this is where we're going. And according to the disciples, it's off schedule, but he sits right there and he has that discussion with that woman there in John chapter 4. Changes that whole city, changes that whole situation. And people would look around. God has made this time and this schedule for you. And maybe we need to reset our schedules. Maybe that's what it's come down to. If anything that 2020 has taught me is that maybe it's time to reset my schedule and reset what I really think is important. Amen. Lazarus is dead, and Jesus finally shows up. But if he had shown up on schedule, he wouldn't have been dead. And Jesus told Mary and Martha, let's reschedule. And he showed up at the right time. Amen. God says, I know you're stuck in your past. Some of us may be stuck in our past. Some of us may look at our past and we can't get past our past. We can't have a future because we're still looking back 2 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago. But some of us may be stuck in the future. Well, I can't wait till this takes place. I can't wait till we come down in all of this. And we keep looking at all these things. And yet God says, I'm the great I am. He didn't give Abraham a schedule. Do you get that? Abraham's 75 years old. He doesn't have Isaac until he's 100. 25 years he's waiting. And God didn't give Abraham a schedule. How many of you think, you know, God, I could trust you better if you gave me that schedule, if you gave me some details, but sometimes those details are left out. In fact, it was about year 11 with Abraham, they decided, okay, we're going to try it our way. Maybe God forgot about us, and so we're going to try it. And that's when Hagar, that's when Ishmael, and all that stuff comes up. And now we have a bunch of problems because of all that. And what does he basically say? No, stay on my schedule when these things are going to take place. Sometimes God gives the details. Remember Numbers chapter 9? He had given the details about how to build a tabernacle. Here's what I want you to do. Here's what I want you to build it. Here's how I want you to use this, the yarn I want. This is the type of things I want you to put inside of it. But do you remember what they would do with that tabernacle? That tabernacle was made to move with the children of Israel as they're wandering through the wilderness, right? And so they would set it up, and if you sit there, and we don't have a lot of time to go into it here, but verse 15 and take on down, he would basically sit here and say, here's what I want you to do. You're going to set up this tabernacle, and remember, God's presence came down. And that's when they knew they kept the tabernacle there. Because that's where God would meet them. And so as they're sitting there and they're meeting it, but when that presence left, what were they supposed to do? That's when you pack up the bags and let's go. And there's something interesting that does take place in here. And if you get time, I want you to go through and look at it. I think it's around verse 22. That it says they would sit there, and whether they stayed and encamped 1 day, 2 days, 1 month, or even a year. Sometimes God tells you what to build, but doesn't tell you when to move. He told Noah, here's how I want you to build the ark. Here's what I want you to do. 120 years later, finally, here comes the rain. And this is what we struggle with. Because in our minds, we wish we could be just nice and perfect and laid out. And God says, do you trust me? Do you trust me? I'm going to put you in Calhoun, Georgia for this time, for this purpose. Do you trust me? You're going to interact with people on a daily basis. Do you trust me? And some of us look back and we say, well, God, you can't use me. Because I'm off schedule. I wasn't supposed to be here like this. My family life wasn't supposed to be like this. My job plans and my futures were not supposed to be like this. And God says you're right on schedule. God says you're right on time. And sometimes life comes along and interrupts our rhythm. And sometimes it stinks. But here's the thing, if you go back to Acts chapter 1. He didn't promise the disciples a schedule, but what did he promise them? He promised them a spirit. He promised them that he would be there. You may sit back here this morning and you may be sitting here saying, I'm off schedule. But I'm here to tell you something. It doesn't matter what your schedule is. God says, I made an appointment. And you're right on time. And for some of us, we may have sit back and we have been looking and wandering for something years. And we're sitting here saying, what do you want from me? And he's opened the door for you. I don't know, as those disciples are sitting there 10 days later, here comes that mighty rushing wind coming through in Acts chapter 2, and this is it. Okay, this is the time. I don't know if they had the plan of what they were going to do and walk out there. I don't know if they had thought that they would have the reaction that they had. But when God called them to come and move, they moved. And what do you have? 2,000 years later, you have places like what we have right here in Calhoun, and we're coming together and we're meeting and we're worshiping and we're praising God, and we are going to take the Lord's Supper here. We're going to remember that death. We're going to remember that sacrifice. We have these places all around the world because those 12 men moved when God said move. And Peter gets up there on that day and he preaches that first sermon that we have recorded. And he says, what we have, you can have too. What can we do? They asked. And he simply said, you repent, baptize in the name of Jesus, forgive us of our sins, and you will receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. You'll have the same promise. Because this is also not just for you, for your children, for all generations. Right. Go back to that promise that he made to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. That is you living out the promise here today. When he said, I will bless the nations, I will make your name great. It is through Abraham Jesus came. And you are here today because of that. And the same promise is open to you. For those who've never put on Jesus Christ in baptism, and you may sit back and you say, this is not my time. And God may be saying, yes, you're right on schedule. I know it's a messed up world, but you're right on schedule. And some of you may need to take that step of faith this morning that sits there and says, I'm ready. I don't know what tomorrow brings, but I know my God will bring me through. And we've got to start living like that, church. So I'm about to get into the sermon. Yes, what time is it? I know I did good. I don't have to watch We have got to start living and being people of faith and not living in and just saying words. Yeah, I have faith, but people who truly live by faith. If the church of Jesus would actually stand up and say, I trust him, I'm going to live by faith no matter what tomorrow, I don't see what's going to happen, but I'm going to trust him. If we would start living like that, I promise you, the world would change. Amen. The world would change if we would actually step out and say, this is what I'm going to do. I don't know how I'm going to get there. And when God sits here and he says, it may not be on your schedule, but it's on my schedule, it's time for us to open up our eyes and walk by faith. That's what Paul says. I don't walk by sight, I walk by faith. And it's not just words that sit here and say, oh, yeah, I trust you, God. No. Faith is believing that God can do something that you and I can't do physically. That you and I, that we can look at something and say, I don't know how we're going to do it. God says, it's perfect for me. Amen. Praise the Lord. And you may be sitting there this morning and you say, I'm not on schedule with what I am. And God says, yes, here you are. I don't care about your past. I don't care about what you've done. I don't care that you've gotten on schedule. Here you are now. Let's reset. That's what this invitation, that's what it's all about. It's a mystery, and God sits here and says, let me explain it. And so for you, so with me, 2020 may seem like it's messed up for you, and God says it's a perfect time for you. We've got a family here. We're ready to pray. And we're ready to work. And we're ready to love each other. You want to get back on schedule? You want to get on God's schedule? Maybe it's this time. That was past. Maybe it's this time. Get rid of the past. There's nothing that the blood of Jesus cannot fix. There's nothing that Jesus